What if Rome never fell? Like not survived for another 100 years, or limped along as some tiny little state in Italy, but the actual Roman Empire somehow makes it all the way to the modern day, where France as we know it might never exist, and Spain could look completely different. Well, somewhere in 2026 there is a guy sitting in traffic under an SPQR flag complaining about taxes to a government that is over 2,000 years old. Because if Rome never falls, then we are not really changing one event anymore. We are removing the giant Roman-shaped hole that medieval Europe eventually grows out of, which means basically everything after it has to find another way to happen. But before Rome gets nuclear weapons and Wi-Fi, there is one pretty major problem. It has to survive the 5th century first. Now by the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire is in a pretty terrible spot, because even though there is still an emperor, and Roman armies are still running around, the actual system underneath them is starting to come apart with large parts of Gaul and Hispania slipping away, while Germanic groups build their own power inside Roman territory, and the Vandals have taken North Africa, which is especially bad, because that region provides exactly the kind of money and resources Rome desperately needs to stop losing everything else. So Rome gets stuck in this beautiful little death spiral, where losing territory means losing taxes, and losing taxes means fewer soldiers, which makes it easier to lose even more territory. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, they keep replacing emperors, because apparently repeatedly removing the guy running the collapsing government will eventually make the government more stable. But in 457, a guy named Majorian becomes emperor. And unlike a lot of people getting the job around this point, he actually seems to understand what is happening. So he campaigns in Gaul and Hispania, before preparing a huge invasion of North Africa, because if Rome can get those provinces back, then suddenly the Western Empire has money and ports and resources flowing into the system again. In our timeline, his fleet is destroyed, before the invasion really gets going, and a few years later, Majorian is removed and killed, which is not exactly ideal for the whole saving Rome thing. So that is what we change. The fleet survives, and Majorian gets enough of North Africa back, that the Western Empire finally has some breathing room, while his victories give him enough political credibility to actually stay emperor for more than 5 minutes. That does not magically rebuild the empire at its peak, but Rome does not need that. It just needs enough stability that every new crisis stops being the one that finally kills it. Majorian rebuilds the tax base and strengthens Italy, while making deals with the Germanic groups Rome can no longer realistically remove, because by now these people are not standing outside the empire, waiting to invade it. They are already inside, and many of them already serve in Roman armies anyway. So land and Roman titles start being exchanged for military service and loyalty, while regional leaders get to keep some of their power, as long as that power still technically belongs to Rome. Messy? Absolutely. But it works well enough that when Majorian eventually dies, he leaves behind something much more useful than himself, a functioning state. So 476 arrives, and there is still an emperor in the west, and there is still a Roman government in Italy. And the year that was supposed to mark the death of Western Rome just kind of happens. Rome survives, but now has to figure out what exactly it survived with. So Rome can either spend the next century fighting everyone inside its own borders, or it can do something it has already been doing for hundreds of years: make them Roman. Rome did not become enormous, because everybody inside the empire came from Italy. Roman identity kept expanding until people whose ancestors had fought Rome were serving as Roman generals and senators, and eventually even emperors. So in this timeline, that process simply continues instead of being interrupted by the Western collapse. The Franks in Gaul become Roman Franks, while Gothic leaders in Hispania are brought into the imperial system and given land and military commands, in exchange for staying loyal to Rome. Basically, you already control part of Gaul, and 10,000 armed men listen to you, so congratulations. You work for Rome now. Here's a title. Please stop burning the tax office. And obviously, these rulers are not suddenly loyal little government employees, because some of them are still going to rebel, and others will basically behave like kings, while insisting they technically are not kings, but over generations. The important thing changes because political ambition stays inside the Roman system rather than building entirely new states outside it, which means France probably never happens. At least not France as we know it, because the Franks never get the same opportunity to build an independent kingdom across Gaul, while Hispania never develops through the same Visigothic kingdom that existed in our timeline. The local cultures still develop, and Latin still changes into regional languages, because Rome cannot stop people pronouncing words differently for 1,000 years, but politically these places remain connected by the same Roman state. So instead of Western Europe breaking into the familiar medieval kingdoms, you get this increasingly decentralized Roman world, where people might be Gallic or Hispanic or Italian locally while still being Roman politically. And honestly, Augustus would probably hate it. But Augustus is dead, and somehow his empire is not. Unfortunately, while Rome has spent the last century figuring out how to absorb everybody already inside its borders, something completely new is appearing outside them. By the early 600s, this new version of Rome has had more than a century to settle in, and while the empire is definitely not back to casually conquering everything, it sees the West never fragmented the way it did in our timeline, and the Mediterranean is still holding this huge political system together. Then Islam emerges in Arabia, and after Muhammad unites much of the Arabian Peninsula, the early caliphates begin expanding outward incredibly quickly, through Syria and Persia and Egypt, before eventually pushing across North Africa. In our timeline, this happens at a perfect time, because the Eastern Romans and Sasanian Persians have spent years beating the absolute hell out of each other, which leaves both exhausted when this new power arrives. Persia eventually collapses while Rome survives, but loses some of its richest territory, including Egypt, which is one of those places you really do not want to lose if your empire enjoys money and food. Our Rome has one major advantage: the West is still there. Now that does not mean some extra taxes from Gaul magically teleport an army into Egypt and stop the conquest, because Rome is still going to lose territory. But the difference is that losing Syria or Egypt no longer leaves an increasingly isolated eastern state behind. There is still Italy and Gaul and Hispania, and a much larger population and economy that can rebuild an army and come back later. So Rome can lose, it just cannot be finished. And over the next few centuries, the Mediterranean becomes this enormous frontier between two major political worlds, where Roman and Islamic states trade with each other, and fight each other, and steal ideas from each other, while Sicily repeatedly discovers the downside of existing directly between all of them. Neither side disappears, and that competition probably becomes one of the reasons Rome keeps modernizing, because having a powerful rival across the sea is a fantastic reason to make sure your fleet still works. By the medieval period, Rome has now survived Germanic migrations, and internal collapse, and one of the fastest imperial expansions in history. But everything it has survived so far is something Rome understands. Armies invade and provinces rebel, and somebody wants the throne. The next problem is much worse. The world keeps changing, adapting to a world that looks less Roman every year. Warfare changes and cities grow, while gunpowder appears and ocean trade becomes increasingly important, so the empire has to let its old institutions evolve instead of preserving them like historical decorations. The legion eventually disappears into whatever military system comes next, while stronger provincial governments grow out of the autonomy. Rome already gave its regional rulers, and as Atlantic trade becomes more important, Rome has ports in Hispania and Gaul, which means there is basically no chance everyone else starts exploring the world, while Rome sits around pretending the Atlantic is decorative. And once somebody comes back saying there's an entire continent across the ocean, I have a hard time imagining the Roman government responding with anything other than an immediate argument about how much of it should belong to Rome. Then industrialization arrives, and the empire gets its biggest political test yet, because factories and railways and mass education make an old-style absolute emperor increasingly difficult to justify and also increasingly difficult to keep alive. So instead of waiting for the entire system to explode, Rome changes again. The Senate gains real political power, and provincial governments become more representative, while the emperor slowly turns into something closer to a constitutional head of state, because the empire finally figures out the one rule that has kept it alive this entire time. Rome does not need to keep the same system, it just needs to keep being Rome. So the legion becomes a modern army, and the Roman road becomes a railway, and then a highway, while the Senate that once debated wars against Carthage is eventually arguing about internet regulations. And somewhere there is still a government employee asking why you filled out the wrong form. Some things are eternal, so after all of that, we finally get to 2026, and somehow Rome is still here, which means the empire has existed for so long that the people living inside it probably do not think of Rome as ancient at all. It is just their country. Obviously, nobody is walking to work in a toga while checking emails on a marble tablet, because after 1500 extra years of change, Augustus would probably walk into modern Rome and assume somebody else conquered the place. But he would recognize the branding. SPQR is still on government buildings and passports and military vehicles and probably trash cans, while the empire, underneath all of that, looks more like a gigantic federation than anything an ancient Roman would recognize. Gaul and Hispania and Italy have spent centuries developing their own languages and identities, while remaining politically connected to Rome, so France never exists in quite the same way, and Spain develops completely differently, while Italy never needs to unify into a modern state, because the government sitting in Rome never disappeared in the first place. The emperor might still exist, but by now he is basically the living mascot of an institution that refuses to die, while actual power sits with the Senate and regional governments. And militarily, this empire is probably one of the major global powers, because a huge industrial state covering large parts of Europe and sitting across some of the most important trade routes on Earth is eventually going to get jets and satellites and aircraft carriers, and yes, probably nuclear weapons. Which means at some point somebody takes the eagle that once sat on top of a legionary standard and paints it onto a missile. Rome itself would probably be the strangest part, because the ancient monuments are not surrounded by a city remembering a dead civilization, and that civilization is still using them. Subway tunnels run beneath streets that have existed for thousands of years, while government towers sit next to ancient temples, and some guy who walks past all of it every morning is mostly annoyed because traffic is terrible, and the Senate raises taxes again. To us, the strange part is that Rome survived. To him, it never went anywhere. So yeah, Rome somehow makes it all the way to 2026, and after more than 2,000 years, it is still here. Leave me a what if scenario you would like to see in the comments. Anyway, subscribe for more alternate history.